Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. The Broadband Bunch Zero Touch Learning Series is live. I'm Craig Corbin. Thanks so much for joining us today. Our session, State and Regional Broadband Funding Options. The Broadband Bunch podcast and Zero Touch Learning Series presented by Utopia Fiber, building a more connected nation, by DXTEL, creators of the Harper Broadband Marketing Library, by Calyx, the cloud and software platforms to simplify businesses, excite subscribers, and grow value, by ITK, In the Know Solutions Group, process first, technology second, and by your Zero Touch Automation experts, ETI Software Solutions. Be sure to follow the Broadband Bunch on Facebook at facebook.com/the Broadband Bunch and on Twitter at Podcast Bunch. You can access Broadband Bunch podcast on Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, and on iHeartRadio. A couple of quick reminders before we introduce our panel. Today's session is interactive. If you have questions, please submit them via the chat function. Our team will be monitoring those throughout the event. The session will also be recorded and will be available for future access. In addition, we would really appreciate if you could share any potential topics for future Zero Touch Learning Series sessions, or if you'd like to suggest prospective panelists. And again, that can be done via the chat function. And thanks in advance for your participation. Time now to introduce our moderator, a 30-year veteran of the communications industry. Heather Gold is CEO of HBG Strategy and previously served as president and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association, following her tenure as senior vice president of external affairs and access management for XO Communications. She graduated magna cum laude from Tufts University with bachelor's and master's degrees in economics, earned an MBA in finance and marketing from Washington University in St. Louis, and also completed the general management program of the Harvard Business School. Our moderator for state and regional broadband funding options, Heather Gold. Heather, should be a great conversation today.
I am so excited about this, Craig. I was just talking earlier with a group of people about how the states are not waiting, which may or may not be a good thing given the lack of cohesiveness in Washington these days. But I'm very excited about the group. And in the wake of the pandemic, policymakers across the country have created new broadband funding programs, and they have budgeted more money than ever before. While we have yet to see the impact of state and local coronavirus funds that should become available soon, I know that we'll hear about that a little bit from California, and my home state, Virginia, just announced that they would be using American Rescue Plans for broadband as well. We anticipate that these funds will be used by most states and regional commissions to go into further broadband installations. Proposed infrastructure funding is currently in front of the Congress. Not to be skeptical, ladies and gentlemen, but I've lived outside DC for too long to say that that is money in the bank yet. On the front lines of citizen needs are the states, many of which recognized years ago that they would need to step up their efforts to get better broadband to their citizens. And what makes a successful program? An updated 2021 Pew Research report lists strong funding and operational programs as key to any successful state broadband program. And today, we are fortunate to have representatives from 3 well-organized and well-funded states that can detail why and how they manage their broadband deployment programs. We are also joined from a representative of the Appalachian Region Commission, one of the most active regional commissions in assisting underserved rural communities in their broadband challenges. Let me introduce today's panelists quickly. Russ Elliott is the director of the Washington State Broadband Office. Bradley Robke, who is the grants program analyst with the Appalachian Regional Commission, and he will be our voice-only panelist. Angie Dickinson is the executive director of the Office of Broadband Development at the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development, commonly known as DEED, which is easier to say. And last but certainly not the least is Robert Osborne, who's director of the Communications Division for the California Public Utility Commissions. So I would like each of you to take approximately 5 minutes and discuss your state's or agency's approach to encouraging broadband deployment, how these offices assist, and what your primary goals are. So with that, I'm going to ask Russ to lead off first.
Thank you, Heather. It's a pleasure to be here today, and it's a fantastic time to be in this game right now and be in the places that many of these states are with regard to pre-planning and focusing on what's happening. Because as you mentioned, there's a lot of money coming down the pipe, and we need to make certain we're doing good work. So Washington State has gone a very unique approach, and I'll go ahead and go to the next slide. The state broadband office sits underneath the Department of Commerce here, which is interesting, and it allows us to be coordinating with a number of the programs around the state, including the infrastructure programs, which is very convenient. So that's just an informative slide there. So next slide. This slide here will outline our strategy. This is what we believe is the current path and the right path for states to really pursue, a good angle for these funds. This is what we've done for a number of years. We believe that everything starts now from the community up. It's no longer a provider down discussion. We have to start to identify those communities that need support. We have to empower those communities to have intelligent conversations around what it is they want, what it is they need, and be champions on their own behalf to try to empower broadband, better broadband and infrastructure in their communities. We as a state partner there. So what we do is we encourage these partnerships. We have partnerships called broadband action teams all across the state. Those broadband action teams include providers, it includes healthcare, it includes education, includes the city, county economic development folks, and concerned citizens. And they all get together in these communities and they talk about what it is they want. Because we can't talk anymore in broad stroke discussions around broadband. We have to be more focused and more intentional in our conversations. So these partnership levels allow these communities to come together and really identify the areas of need. Your meeting today is called State and Regional Funding and Planning. We really do think regional is where it's at. It's no longer, I can't as a state decide until I've got better information from the regions within my state and allow them to be unique in their approach. Partnering, next we plan, so we help those partners now come together with plans, identify the shovel-ready projects. We've been doing this for a couple of years, and look what's happened. Dog that caught the bus. Here comes the money. We've got the plans. We've got a couple $1 billion worth of projects sitting around waiting to get funded. We're ready to start to throw those projects at these funding opportunities coming down the pipe. So we really believe like we've set this up for success. We want to maximize those funds. We have some state funds. We also allocated about $400 million out of our ARPA funds into broadband infrastructure. So we're taking that, we're going to maximize those funds and try to get as much as we can out of the other federal monies with those monies and really be efficient and effective in our pledge. Then finally, we talk about building, and we do not want to do anything but build future-proof, scalable, sustainable infrastructure. We don't want to mess around with one-time money that's going to be outdated at the end of the funding cycle. Technology that will be no longer useful, such as we've been doing the last few years, last few decades. So what we want to do is truly believe in it, invest in that future-proof scalable infrastructure. So as a state, we get behind that. We have the most aggressive goals in the country, 150 symmetrical to every citizen by 2028 in Washington State. Big moonshot goal, but it's one we want to shoot for so that we can really make certain that we're putting good use to the funds that are here. Then obviously, the big, the accelerated interest around digital equity and inclusion, that has to be included in everything you do when you talk about affordability, talk about skills and tools. So we really put that as part of that. Next slide. I'm a big believer what gets measured gets done. I do not believe that we can, again, talk in broad stroke terms. We have to talk about specifics. We've stood up a mapping program here to the premise, which allows us not to talk in shape files or census blocks or any of those heat maps. We're talking about to the door. We believe broadband is a door-to-door, street-to-street discussion. This is the level of detail we need. So we went after this about 2 years ago, started to develop a very detailed map. Red, green, black, red, yellow, black is bad, green is good. You can see a populated area is doing really, really well. But what we've done is we've given a tool to those communities that say, I don't have good broadband. And they can now define what that means. And so now we can talk about it more intelligently about where we're going to focus our funds, focus our energies. And now when we have these opportunities for funds, we have the opportunity to really look at projects that are very easily identifiable. This allows each community to have have a dashboard. All the counties have dashboards. All the legislative districts have dashboards. So no longer can people talk about broadband generally. You have to talk about it specifically in Washington State. So next slide, please. You know, there's a lot of funds. I mean, I'm not gonna sit here too long. I'm just gonna say that USDA's got a bunch of money. NTIA right now is in the middle of a funding round. We're putting together some projects for that. $1 billion for tribes. We've got 29 reservations up here. We're really focusing on making certain we maximize those federal funds. We found that the three areas that have been challenging for folks to go get money is technical support. They don't know how to get started. Filling out grant applications. They have no clue how to do that, what to do there, and matching funds, especially for our communities in need. We've supplied funding for each of those buckets through this office for this year coming up. So there is no excuses in Washington State. So we're chasing the money, FCC, NTIA, USDA, all of that money, obviously the ARPA money, and then any of the funds that potentially come from broadband infrastructure in the infrastructure package. Next. Oh, I guess that's it. So there you have it. What we do really well is we are managing that from the level of detail. We have a mapping initiative. We're really focused on making certain we're telling a very specific story, so we're pursuing funds in a very specific way. So that's the unique thing that we're doing here, focus and intention.
Okay, Rob, why don't you go next?
Thank you. So I'm Robert Osborne from the California Public Utilities Commission, and I'm director of the Communications Division, which does, we regulate the telecommunications sector and subsidize broadband deployment. So next slide, please. Thank you. So last week we had some landmark legislation passed by the legislature to fund broadband in a much different way than we have traditionally. So $6 billion total was passed. And the breakdown of that is middle mile and last mile. The middle mile piece, the funding is $3.25 billion to acquire, build, maintain, and operate an essential open access statewide middle mile network, similar to what you've seen in other states on the education side, educational networks. And California also has an education network that's operated by an organization called CNIC, which connects all the universities and libraries and community colleges. So that will be overseen by the Department of Technology, and we will be working with them on providing locations and information on where to build. And then the deployment will be done through Caltrans, our Department of Transportation. The last mile piece, $2 billion funding to deploy last mile networks to connect to this middle mile network. And traditionally, we've had trouble or difficulty in getting money to the traditionally high cost areas of the state, particularly rural areas where there's just not enough housing density and income to prove in a network build. Part of that has been because there hasn't been any middle mile network available. So really the plan is to combine the middle mile build with the last mile funding to be able to provide broadband in these traditionally unserved or underserved communities. And then of that, there's $50 million for technical assistance that would be provided to municipalities to come up with their own broadband plan. Finally, there's a loan loss reserve account amount that's set aside to essentially serve as seed money for municipalities to float bonds to fund broadband networks. Next slide, please. So our universal service programs, we have 6 universal service programs at the PUC. So I'll just go from the top, the Lifeline program, which is really an add-on to the federal Lifeline. The state provides up to $14.85 per month on top of the $9.25. That includes some broadband pieces because of bundled services through wireless. So we fund plans up to 12 gigabytes of data per month. And I think we have probably one of the most generous Lifeline offerings of all the states. And then the Teleconnect Fund is a component, essentially an add-on to E-rate. So we provide additional funding to schools and libraries that receive E-rate. We provide a subsidy for broadband connectivity. The deaf and disabled program is still traditionally more of a voice-based program, but we're in the process of working through the modernization of that as we move to all IP services. And then the California Advanced Services Fund, which is our kind of our hallmark broadband subsidy program, has a number of sub-accounts. The biggest one of those is funding infrastructure. There's a $325 million set aside for that. And basically what that's meant is we publish a map, we have technology neutral eligibility criteria, and providers apply for grants. The challenge has been it's very provider and incumbent driven. It doesn't address traditionally high cost areas, as I've said. However, with the new legislation that was passed last week, the eligibility was raised from 6-1 to 6 down, 1 up to 25-3, which is what the FCC uses to define advanced telecommunication services. And the deployment requirement now is 100 down and 20 up, so pretty generous in that regard. We are also adding caseworkers. So whereas before we waited for providers to apply, we're now looking to be more proactive and engage with localities in putting together broadband plans and putting together funding so that you can have a whole package to deploy broadband in a community. There's also a public housing sub-account, adoption sub-account, regional consortia sub-account, and tribal technical assistance as part of CSF. The bottom two, the high cost funds, these have been traditionally voice-based, and so High Cost Fund A supports 10 of the 13 rural telephone companies that still operate on rate cases in California. And then the High Cost Fund B supports Frontier and AT&T, and to a small extent Consolidated for high cost voice services. Next slide, please. So this slide really is just to provide an overview. We have 58 counties in California, and you can see, working from the left statewide, we have the total population that's offered fixed broadband, and this is fixed broadband adoption at 100 megabits per second down, which, as I said earlier, is the new deployment, part of the new deployment requirement for CASF. Of those, the consumer connections are about 7.3 million. And this is again at 100 down. So our adoption rate, consumer connections convert to population. So we took the 7.3 million, converted to population, and then that works out to about just over 50% adoption at 100 down. So you can see we have quite a ways to go on the adoption side. And to me, this is a more relevant figure than deployment, because traditionally, as you all know, deployment has been hamstrung by how we define deployment with regard to having one consumer connection available at a census block. And I think that obviously will be changing as the FCC modernizes how they do their mapping. And that's the end of my presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. Well, both you and Russ have already given me questions. Let's see to ask, so that weren't on my list. But Angie, let's hear about Minnesota.
Thank you, Heather, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be joining you today to discuss broadband development with these distinguished folks and to share a little bit of background on our efforts here in Minnesota. Next slide, please. When we're asked about Minnesota's broadband plan, we like to talk about how it is intentionally high level and dynamic in order to respond to changing conditions and the unique combinations of variables that exist in each region of our state. This slide shows the 4 tiles that make up Minnesota's broadband policy and program work. The first element to consider is our state broadband goals. These goals set a compass point for all of our work. We have 2 speed goals set in statute for the years 2022 and 2026 to have a statewide access at 25 by 3 for 22 and 100 by 20 for 2026. The second component is our data and mapping program. This work allows our office and others to measure progress toward the goals, identify gaps, and check the need for program realignment to address evolving needs and conditions across the state. The third piece provides a focal point and guidance, and that's our broadband office, which gives us a place from which to support communities and the providers doing the work to deploy broadband, and to make sure we're leveraging those investments to the fullest extent possible. The other entity on this tile is our Governor's Task Force on Broadband, which brings together a diverse group of broadband stakeholders to provide guidance on broadband policy going forward. Finally, the grant program was created in 2014 and gives us a tool to materially participate in and collaborate on the solutions to close the gaps. Next slide, please. Early on, Minnesota understood the importance that good and ubiquitous connectivity would have on our state's economy and the vitality of our rural communities, and began working on that challenge in earnest as early as 2008. In 2014, the state set a goal of border-to-border broadband access by 2022, signaling that access to quality broadband service should be a right for all Minnesotans. Since 2014, the Border-to-Border Broadband Development Grant has invested over $126 million to provide broadband access for over 56,000 homes and businesses in unserved and underserved areas of our state. Next slide, please. Minnesota's grant program is designed to provide financial assistance for the acquisition and installation of middle mile and last mile broadband infrastructure. This slide gives some examples of some of the costs that are currently allowed under our program. Next slide, please. Historically, Minnesota's grant program has been funded by state general fund appropriations. Going forward, Minnesota intends to use at least $70 million of its U.S. Treasury Capital Projects Fund allocation to fund our grant program over the next 2 fiscal years. As we are waiting for Treasury guidance on these funds, we're not certain that the current statutory parameters of our program will align with federal requirements. Fortunately, our legislature gave us some leeway to adjust our program parameters if needed. That's my little caveat here with the items on this slide. This slide highlights our current program parameters, and as I said, if we need to make some tweaks going forward with the federal funding, we plan to do that. But currently, our program requires that the technology that's funded with our state dollars is scalable to at least 100 meg symmetrical. We cap our awards at $5 million per award, and we require a 50% match. We're also required to geographically disperse these funds, and we look forward to launching our next grant round when we know more about our federal funding opportunities. And that's my quick summary for Minnesota. Thank you.
Thanks, Angie. And now we're going to hear from Brad.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Bradley Roepke. I'm a infrastructure program analyst with the Appalachian Regional Commission. Obviously, we're a little bit different because we are not a state. We are a economic development agency based in DC and serving Appalachia. We actually fund a lot of different types of projects that are related to economic development. We do workforce development, water sewer projects, access to capital. More recently, we've been involved with substance abuse recovery programs, but of course, I'm here to talk to you about our broadband program. So just a little bit about ARC, because I know a lot of you might not be familiar with us. We are a federal state government partnership. Our region spans 13 states and covers 420 counties. We are led by a federal co-chair who's appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Current federal co-chair is Gail Manchin. And so a little bit about kind of our funding, which comes from Congress. For fiscal year 2021, we were allocated $180 million. That kind of gets separated out into 2 different buckets. We have an area development program where each of our 13 states gets kind of like an allocation to spend on a number of different economic development projects. So this current fiscal year was $130 million. And then we have a power program, which I'll talk to you about in a little bit. But that's specifically money that's set aside for coal-impacted communities. Combined through these 2 buckets, last year we spent over $21 million on broadband projects throughout the region, and we're expecting that number to increase over the next couple of years just because of the vast need for broadband. Go to the next slide. So here's just kind of like a quick breakdown of how we're structured, because again, we're very different from just like a state. Most of our projects come from the local level. It's not a top-down approach. So we have 73 local development districts throughout our region. They are our partners at the local level that help a lot with project development. Most of our grantees are either municipalities, counties, economic development associations, nonprofit organizations. In fact, all of our grantees have to be non-for-profit. They can't be for-profit. At the state level, we're led by the 13 governors of our region. Each governor usually selects an alternate to tend to ARC business. And each state has a state program manager, and the program manager is the one person at each state that kind of manages the ARC program and directs the investments in the projects that ARC invests in per each state. And then at the federal level, again, we're led by Gail Manchin, and at the federal level, it's our job to ensure that federal interests are being pursued, and Gail has a final say on all awards. I can go to the next slide. The previous slide was kind of the flow of funds for our area development program. It starts at the local level and works its way up. The other bucket of money that I was talking about earlier, which is POWER, it stands for Partnerships for Opportunity, Workforce, and Economic Revitalization. It's a mouthful, so we just call it POWER. But this program is specifically designed to help communities that are impacted by the downturn in the coal industry. And it's not just coal mining, it's also coal-powered electric plants, coal transportation and logistics, all of that, all these different sub-industries that are affected by the downturn in the coal economy. So the typical timeline for this program, RFPs are issued in January, and applications are due usually late March, early April. For this current year, fiscal 21, the POWER program was allocated $55 million up to, and of that bucket of money, up to 1/3 is available for broadband deployment. I will note that the current appropriations bill that was that's going through the House right now would increase this amount to $65 million. But as Heather said before, we don't want to count our chickens before they hatch because it has to be approved by the House and the Senate. You can go to the next slide. So just a couple of requirements for for those of you that are wanting to maybe pursue ARC funding for a broadband project. As I mentioned before, cannot be a for-profit entity, which specific to the broadband world has some challenges because a lot of incumbent providers are for-profit entities, so that creates its own kind of set of challenges. ARC projects do require matching funds. The amount of match that's needed is based upon the economic status of the county where the project is located. And there's a map there that kind of shows the red and the orange are the most economically distressed counties, and they have the lowest match requirements for projects. And then finally, for broadband projects, they cannot overlay adequate existing broadband service. We're trying to target areas that are completely unserved by broadband or are underserved. And the thresholds that we have for a wireless project, the area cannot have more than 25 3 megabytes per second. And for a fiber project, we have a higher threshold, 100 up, 100 down for businesses, and 50 up, 10 down for residential. You can go to the next slide. So if you're interested in applying for ARC money or want to know more about it, highly encourage you to just visit arc.gov. You can also contact your state program manager or your local development district. All of their contact information is available on our website. Thank you.
Thanks, Bradley. I just want to start in on some questions, and I think the big one to launch is we've all seen dramatic increase in demand as a result of the pandemic. And how has this impacted your state, and how have you attempted to meet that demand? And are you seeing it continue? Do you think that it will continue? And let me start with Angie first to see what she's seen in Minnesota with the pandemic.
Well, certainly, in Minnesota during the pandemic, we definitely saw an increase in demand, but in particular from our underserved areas. And for our purposes, we define those areas that have at least a 25/3 service, but don't have access to that 100/20 speed. That would be our 2026 goal. And, I'm sure as every other state with and underserved areas, as everyone was doing everything from home online where they could, those even the 25/3 speeds weren't necessarily adequate for folks. So that's where we saw the increase in demand. The demand for service from our unserved areas, those areas that lack a 25/3 service, has remained constant, and those voices are still very much being heard, but they have been consistently there. And we expect this will continue. We're thrilled about the amount of funding that is being made available for infrastructure, and look forward to working with these federal programs.
Russ, what have you seen in Washington?
Yeah, great question. And it wasn't so much the demand for more broadband. What it became, through pandemic is we saw a wave of need for affordability. People were losing their jobs. They lost their, they couldn't go to school. And that's where they had their primary connectivity to the internet, so they had to come home. And now all of a sudden they're in a less fortunate economic position, and now they can't afford it. So we really had huge demand for an affordability effort here. And so we embraced the EBB at a big level here in our state and really tried to promote that to make certain everybody had access to that subsidy. And then obviously the second thing that became relevant here was adequacy of connectivity. 25/3 up to was not cutting it when you had 3 or 4 connections, simultaneously for entertainment and for work and those kind of things at home. So we have started a real focus again on embracing this future-proof scalable infrastructure to make sure that we are going to meet future demand, because if we can't meet today, I mean, we've got some challenges ahead of us. So those are the 2 big ones we saw here.
So you see it continuing, the growth in demand.
Oh, no question. Yeah, well, broadband grows at about 50%. Demand for connectivity and speed grows about 50% a year. So this is the only infrastructure in the world that grows at that rate. And so we have to continue to look at ways to make certain that we are building that infrastructure. And if I can say one more thing, one of the big things that I say out loud right now is, look, we're borrowing against my 6-year-old's future right now. He's going to be paying this back in about 15 to 20 years. He better be using the infrastructure we invest in today and not having to look at new ways to build infrastructure when his time comes. So I'm really big about this future-proof, scalable, one-time investment. Let's do it right.
Robert, what are you seeing in California?
Sorry about that. I was dealing with the mute. Yeah, so I think all the providers recorded a jump in demand. So that's, and not controversial at all. Look at the emergency broadband benefit that the FCC is implementing. California has over 430,000 subscribers out of a nationwide total of 3.5 million. We have 83 providers offering this program, and that alone sort of demonstrates the need for broadband. One of the things that we tried to do, sort of as a stopgap measure when COVID hit, was provide hotspots to students, but that's not a permanent solution. So really the challenge for us is getting reliable home internet connections to all those students who have hotspots so that they can do homework from home, as opposed to going to places where they're not open, or they've been trying to do workarounds up until now, and I think that the pandemic really just highlighted the need.
And Brad, how about your resources at ARC? Have they been under barrage for demands for more money for broadband? Have you seen the impact of the pandemic on your requests?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, it probably doesn't come as a shock to anybody, but yes, we've seen a tremendous increase in demand for broadband. A lot of people are applying for broadband projects, for funding from ARC for broadband projects. In the past, prior to the pandemic, our focus primarily was actually on businesses, getting broadband to businesses, because again, we're an economic development agency. So Appalachia has a hard time recruiting businesses if there's not adequate infrastructure there. So broadband, of course, being a critical recruitment tool, without it, it's hard to get businesses to invest in Appalachia. But now, since the pandemic, we've seen an enormous growth in the increase in demand for residential broadband as more people are working from home, accessing education at home, telehealth, all of these things, prior to the pandemic that were happening in person are now happening online. So ARC has just very recently, in the last year or so, had to kind of dramatically shift our approach in not just focusing on providing broadband to businesses, but also to residences as well.
And have you guys seen a impact primarily from underserved urban core or rural underserved, and does it matter? Have you just seen the growth explode regardless of geographic location? Whoever wants to jump in first, that's fine.
Sure. I'll jump in, Heather. We definitely, it's the greatest need in our rural areas, but as others have mentioned, poverty and the ability to afford broadband service has been an issue statewide during the pandemic. And I got to add, I'm so impressed with the providers who serve our state. When the pandemic hit, as we said, as we've all been saying, there was this increase in demand for service. And these folks, wherever they could, they got out there and got homes connected. It may not have been pretty, but they came up with ways to get folks connected as quickly as they could, even deploying broadband in a box type of service so that folks could do that connection in their home on their own to keep everyone safe, as we're all figuring out how to keep each other safe during the pandemic.
So, Rob, you have some large swaths of urban core. What were you seeing? Or was it your remote areas as people fled the urban core?
Yeah, I don't know so much people fleeing the urban core, aside from San Francisco, people moving to Austin, Texas. That was in the news. But definitely a problem of affordability, as was mentioned earlier, because people are losing jobs and people getting disconnected. We did institute a moratorium for disconnections, but because of our authority, that only applied to voice services. However, a lot of voice services are bundled with broadband, so there was a follow-on benefit in keeping people connected. I think another challenge, though, that's unrelated to the pandemic is the fact that a lot of telephone companies are discontinuing DSL service. So you have rural communities that are suddenly left as islands with no broadband because the telephone company is no longer offering broadband.
And Russ, did you see something similar?
Yeah, I mean, both listening to both Robert and Angie, same things, right? So our rural areas, they're used to this, right? And so it was just a constant, hey, we need it even more now, So, it became this push to try to figure out how to build in those most rural areas. And then the urban corridor, it was obviously, we've got, as Angie said, our providers do a very good job in our urban areas. And from our mapping, we can see that we have tremendous broadband in most of our urban areas. It's just a matter of, can they afford it? Do they have the ability to access it if it's there?
So I wanted to move into inhibitors to more deployment, and obviously a big one that comes up is adoption and funding. And why don't you talk about how your state, some of their programs for both adoption and funding, which are sort of tied, and what kind of reach out you do. Rob or Russ, you want to take that on? And I know Russ has a lot of programs on adoption and reach out. So if you want to start, that'd be great.
Sure. So, one of the things that we've done here is really worked with our community-based organizations to try to make certain that there is awareness in those areas that adoption can happen. I think one of the biggest keys to adoption is rate, right? So what I think the things that we can do fundamentally is to offset some of those capital costs to bring those prices down to allow for folks to have more affordable opportunities within the broadband areas. So that's the area we're focusing in right now, is trying to help assist in those capital costs so there's not that cost of capital in the equation as they're trying to develop their rate structures. So you'll see a lot of that, and you know, for the most part, it's just really community. Again, broadband action teams, we're community-based. We go community up is our discussion. So we really focus on those communities, telling us what's unique in Yakima, where we have a lot of, you know, migrant farm workers, is way different than what's in central, you know, Seattle and downtown King County. So we allow those areas to really kind of own it and design it, and then we work with them.
And Rob, are you seeing the same thing, that adoption is slowed primarily by the rates, that the broadband, the cost of broadband, rather than literacy or ease of use?
Certainly price is the biggest predictor of adoption in our case. So yeah, that's the number one. Digital literacy is the number two, and we do have programs to address that. But another problem we see is in urban areas, some low-income communities simply just don't have access to the network. And so we call them donut holes. How do we fill the donut holes? And part of that is looking at our, we have a statewide digital video franchise regime. It used to be, you know, each cable company had to negotiate with each city. Now it's statewide franchise. We're looking at that now to how we can try and get everyone in a community connected to a cable company at the very least, because that typically, you know, 70% of the connections in California are on cable as opposed to telephone company broadband connections.
And Angie, what are you all doing in Minnesota? I know you have a lot of rural areas. Are you seeing that it's a price or literacy or knowledge that's keeping people from getting as an inhibitor?
As an inhibitor, you know, I would say in some cases it's a matter of access, right? You know, when I look at a lot of our states in the upper Midwest in particular, we've got a rural divide. We've got some of our rural communities that have state-of-the-art connectivity that's better than some of their more urban or suburban counterparts. And they're having success with adoption there as well. And then we have others that are part of that divide where the infrastructure is lacking. You know, it's that population density, cost of construction issue. You know, and of course the other issue is related to poverty and the ability to afford service. And you know, whether that's an issue with the rates, in my mind, I look at whether if somebody is not able to afford broadband service, there may be a whole lot of other things that they're not able to afford as well. So I like to think of it in a more comprehensive way that way.
And Brad, what about the ARC regions? I know you're in a lot of depressed communities in Appalachia there. Is price really a strong inhibitor on broadband deployment?
I mean, it absolutely is. And unfortunately, broadband affordability is the kind of the next frontier for ARC, as especially since the pandemic, we've seen. I think Russ highlighted it in his slides. There's just a huge amount of money coming down the pike for broadband deployment, but once that broadband equipment and infrastructure is deployed, it's how do you make it affordable for people in Appalachia who might be living in poverty, and broadband might be available in their area, but they can't afford it. I think another issue, I think, from the federal perspective is just the maps. I think we've touched on it a little bit earlier, but how do you know where you need to deploy the broadband when the maps that we have are oftentimes very, very inaccurate? I think Russ again talked about the door-to-door approach and specific addresses that do have broadband, that don't have broadband, that that have internet but the speeds aren't high enough. I think that's the future. Whereas, right now, a lot of the data that we have, unfortunately, is too granular. It's too, it's by census block or census tract, and that information is just not accurate enough. So I think that's going to be really important as the federal government and state governments spend more money on deploying broadband infrastructure.
So I did want to ask a follow-up question on the mapping, because a couple of you did touch on it. Were any of you involved in NTIA's recent efforts? And a plug for the Broadband Bunch next month, we will have Sarah Blue from NTIA going over their recent launch of their mapping effort. And do you think it's going to be more helpful? And then it also seems that several of you did your own mapping so that you weren't reliant on the FCC's mapping. So Rob, which way did you guys go? And then I'll call on Angie to tell us about Minnesota.
Yeah, so we began our mapping under the NTIA's ARA grant back in 2010, 2011. So we've been mapping ever since then. We collect data once a year, and we validate it against subscriber data. So if a census block doesn't have a subscriber, we actually count that as not having service. And we use that as the basis for our grant program. So it is somewhat independent from the FCC, but we also use the FCC's 477 data. However, we are hoping to move with the FCC as they move to their building location fabric, where it's at the address level as opposed to the census block.
Okay, so you're literally using your own maps. Angie, what are you all doing?
Minnesota is very similar. The state participated with NTIA early on, and for about the past 5 years has contracted with Connected Nations, who does all of our mapping work for us and our field validation work as well. So we, through their relationship with the broadband providers in our state, we get, in most cases, more granular data than we would get from FCC 477 data.
And Russ?
Yeah, we went straight to the horse's mouth. We got tired of the poor data and decided to take it into our own hands and allow the people to have a voice in this conversation. We've got providers giving us information based on them protecting areas and protecting future growth, and it's time for the people to talk. And so we've allowed the people to have a voice, and it's worked very well. We do partner with NBAM and the NTIA mapping efforts. Again, it's still too broad. We're looking very, very granular. So I don't think it's this or that. I think it's this and that and that and that. So even with the FCC's new program they'll have, certainly it'll be a benefit, but we're never gonna let go of the the opportunity for us to really allow the citizens to have a voice in this conversation.
And Brad, I'm sure your states are all over the map because of the degree of various resources that they have to do mapping.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Some states are, a lot of them are doing just like what Minnesota and Washington and you guys are all doing, just doing their own, using the resources that they have to create their own maps. I will say though that ARC is part of an intergovernment working group where all of the different departments and sub-departments within the federal government that have anything to do with broadband deployment are getting together on like a bi-weekly basis to share where we're investing and what we're investing in. That way we can kind of make sure that we're not double dipping or overlaying each other with broadband infrastructure. So I think that, and then combined with hopefully some better, it might not be perfect, but better mapping and better data from the FCC will help. But I applaud the states that have used their own resources to come up with really, really granular, really great data on the broadband availability in their state.
So I've got a couple of follow-up questions. The first one has to do with mapping, and you guys are going to want to know where this provider is. A provider writes in, mapping is very important. We provide 100 up, 100 down fiber broadband for nearly 9,000 subscribers. I have yet to see us listed on any government map. We began providing service in 2017. Thoughts on how we can ensure we're recognized by the state and federal levels?
I'll just, I'm sorry, it's real easy for me. It's just if you've got customers in Washington State, they just need to take a speed test and we'll recognize it. It's pretty simple. It pops up on our map and then we have that in our records. So it's just a matter of providers actually being proactive in that. If they feel like they do have that better connectivity, I think it's in their best interest to encourage speed tests. Install routers when they install the router, take the speed test before the customer, whatever, but start getting their information on the map so that we can talk about it.
I'm sure you all would like to know where this provider is too. And then a follow-on question has to do with workforce availability, and that being an inhibitor. The ability to have resources that engineer, develop plans, and then assign make ready and deployment clue is a future inhibitor. Do we have any people power to address the gaps by the ARPA deadlines? And how many fiber trucks are rolling in Washington, for example, and are they working around the clock or staying idle due to lack of qualified staff? So there's a question for you all. Have you seen any concern about the diminishing availability of skilled labor to do this fiber deployment? Angie, have you seen it in Minnesota?
I have heard about it anecdotally and not just with the pandemic, but over the last handful of years as companies are looking at the age of their workforce as well. So I would imagine this is an issue nationally.
How about in the states, other states? You got Robert?
I can't speak for like I'll just chime in and say that I can't speak for the availability of like qualified workers, but I know one thing that has been a huge inhibitor is the cost. With inflation of raw materials in recent months, the cost to deploy broadband is skyrocketing, and that's been a real challenge for a lot of our grantees.
Okay.
Yeah, Heather, let's get real here. We're going to have a real supply side issue coming. And, I think everybody's aware of it. We certainly do have a labor issue right now. Hopefully that'll remedy itself here in the future. But the bigger issue right now, and I think the question was, what can we do, as groups? I think one of the things we have to do right now is come together around this ARPA money and make certain that we extend these deadlines to meet reasonable build needs right now, and not just throw, timelines out there just because. I think we have to start to really address the fact that we are going to have supply side issues. We've got some other issues with regard to the workforce. So let's make certain we do this again with intention, not just the fact that we got to spend money. I get so tired of government saying, oh, success is we get money out the door. That's not success. Success right now is an intentional build and intentional development of infrastructure in this country to set us up for future success.
Rob, do you have any insights into this coming supply side issue?
I think it's a real risk we'll have to manage. I could see even fiber optics, right? Just to get the equipment and the fiber itself could be an issue.
Here's a follow-up for Brad. I gather somebody has applied for your power funding and they wanted to know when the applications are going to be approved.
Oh, great question. So we're currently kind of in the thick of our fiscal year 21 power funding cycle. I think projects that are being selected to move forward will be announced sometime this summer, with the final approval of grants being announced sometime in, I want to say, right around the end of the fiscal year, so late September, early October.
Great. Rob, I know California, I know your legislature was supposed to meet yesterday. Did you get the funding that the governor had proposed?
Oh, so the legislature met last Thursday and approved.
Okay.
So that's been passed. Yeah. One thing I didn't mention though is with regard to the funding and availability of equipment and trained staff. I mean, this is, we're all recognizing this, and I think to Russ's point, there's an overly unrealistic expectation that there's this idea of everything being shovel ready, and broadband, like roads and bridges, takes a long time to build. So I think there's a very strong case to be made to try and extend the federal funding spend deadline, which I think is January 1st, 2026, beyond that, because there's just, it's just unrealistic.
And in your own state funding cycles, do you have timelines like that or milestones?
We're tied, currently, I was just going to say, Robert, currently we're tied, we're trying to chase the NTIA money right now. And any of the ARPA money we have, we're dictated by Treasury on that. So it's already outlined for us for the most part. We do have some state funds that we can allow for some more flexibility there, but nothing at the scale of the federal money that's coming out right now with the requirements of those short timelines.
And Angie, do you have any flexibility there?
We have pretty strict timelines in our funding as well, but we do have room to be flexible in the case of construction hurdles and other unexpected circumstances that might come up. But I agree with Russ and Rob. This is a probably once in a lifetime for me opportunity to work with communities with this amount of funding, and it's our opportunity to get it right and to be thoughtful. And my concern is where it has always been: the hardest to serve areas are the folks that need the most help getting started. And my fear is that we still leave those folks behind. These areas, these donut holes, these sparsely populated areas that aren't even the most attractive to our state and federal funding mechanisms. Everybody wants to serve a larger population, and my concern is that we somehow still leave these folks behind. And I think this is our opportunity to get it right. And if we take some thoughtful planning around it, we incorporate those areas into the bigger projects.
I've thought about that a lot, and I tend to agree with you that we seem to keep reinvesting in the same technology, which doesn't get us any closer to reducing the number of folks that don't have broadband service. So it does seem like we do have to do some more proactive funding there. A question has come in from the audience talking about the timelines, because obviously that's on RDOF. Are there any opportunities that in your areas, or from what you hear? Now, I heard this morning that the Treasury funds will be available for overbuilding if they don't meet certain standards. And I think it was Russ or Rob said your standard is 100 or 50 and 10, which is beyond the federal. So do you allow other grant funding to be used in those areas, even if they want a federal funding at a lower speed? There's a lot of concern. This obviously came up with somebody who's concerned about the wireless broadband winter.
Yeah, we certainly are coming up against that here in Washington State. Before I came here, I was in Wyoming, and the last two rounds of reverse auctions resulted in satellite broadband being the adequate broadband for those folks in rural America. That's sinful, and that's just a bad approach. And so I never had a problem overbuilding those areas, but as we start to see the more future-proof, scalable technologies funded, I think we need to allow for that to develop. If it's not terrestrial, we're going to probably push on top of that area to try to get physical infrastructure in the ground into our citizens here. But we'll also stay technologically agnostic on some of those hard to reach last mile areas. So our big one was SpaceX in this state. We love them, and at the same time it's a challenge because we don't want those areas boxed out to be primarily just satellite. we like to get infrastructure to our citizens in the state. So we'll continue to look at where we can do that. But I think the big thing in RDOF and the CAF money is accountability, and that's something we haven't done well in this country. Is held providers accountable to get those services up and running. Look at the CAF monies. It took for so long, and then we got a lot of providers that just defaulted on that and just said, "Oops, sorry," and then got more money the next round of RDOF. You know, so I think we have to really put some type of level of accountability around this and make certain that we are building to that future-proof infrastructure.
And Rob, are you allowing joint use of state grant funds with federal monies to make sure the speeds are coming up?
Yeah, and I think what we decided, because similar to Russ's comment, our experience with the CAF2, so the CAF2, and I'm going to be geeky, CAM 4.3 that went to the ILECs, you know, almost 600 million went to the major telephone companies, and those areas are all RDOF eligible now. So that to me was just like a complete waste of money.
Right.
What we decided though, and then CAF 2903 auction, half the locations for California didn't even get bids. So we decided with RDOF, we really wanted to incentivize, as Russ said, future-proof technology. So we implemented a kicker program where the state will kick in a certain amount of money, up to 20% of the RDOF reserve price, to any winning bidder for, you know, gigabit capable technology. And that's up to our interpretation of what gigabit capable means. There are some carriers we don't think are gigabit capable.
Angie, are you guys allowing any joint use funding and to get the speeds up higher?
We have in the past with the CAF2 funds, where we could pair our state funds with the CAF2 funds to get those higher speeds. With the RDOF awards, with the preliminary awards, the way they were announced, those winners are proposing speeds that meet our state speed goals, so we chose not to put state funds over those federal funds. Not a popular decision in some cases, and we'll just see what we're allowed to do with the Treasury funds going forward.
Yeah, that was an interesting comment I heard this morning, that the Treasury funds had loosened up to permit overbuilding. So I'll have to find out more about that. Brad, what are you guys doing? I know you're probably more strictly held, but are your states that you're operating in pouring in some extra money?
Yeah, I mean, it varies across each state, obviously, but ARC is pretty unique in that our grants can be matched by other federal funding programs. That's very rare in the federal government. Most of the time, other federal match doesn't count as project match, but ARC was specifically designed because we're serving such a impoverished area of the country to allow any and all resources to count as match. The other thing I'll say is we have kind of mulled over with this second round of RDOF how we would handle any projects that overlay or overbuild those RDOF territories that in the auction. And we ended up deciding, because of some of the issues that Russ and Rob were talking about with the providers who win territories in the auction and then take forever to build it out or don't even do it at all. We decided that we want to encourage and incentivize providers and anyone to build in these areas that aren't currently served or are extremely underserved. So we are allowing our federal for our ARC grants to go to projects that overlay some RDOF territory.
Interesting. I agree with Russ that we haven't really had a good system for compliance. I feel like we keep in, obviously as the fiber maven, I have a business case analysis that would show you it was ridiculous ever to put money into more copper. It just moved the ball down the court and didn't really make it future proof. We just had to keep reinvesting. So let's discuss PPP and how significant that, that's everybody's buzzword today, right? Is it becoming a big part of your state? Is it being used widely? to help with more broadband deployment, or is it just, as I said, today's buzzword? So Russ, you started laughing, so.
Well, I don't know if you saw the big legislative kerfuffle we had up here with regard to public infrastructure and retail authority. We passed it, so we're in favor of that here as state legislature was really big on that, and so is the executive branch at the national level, right? You're hearing a lot about public infrastructure and open access networks, and I have to say I agree that there's some need for focus there, but PPPs are easy to talk about. They're really hard to do. And I think that therein lies the challenge that we all have as state folks here that you have on this call right now, is we have to navigate those seas and try to figure out exactly how do you bring together a strong public-private partnership, ensure that the funds that go in there have public good attached to them, and those are challenging conversations, and some states are just strictly public. I've talked to a couple states that are strictly private. I think that's easy to do. But it's, I always contend that if you say it's all private investment that's going to fix it, you're wrong. If you say it's all public investment that's going to fix it, you're wrong. You have to be in this middle ground. We have to play here, and we have to have some of these hard conversations. What I'd love to do is focus more around the country, not as a competition, but as a cooperation, as to where are the best practices of public-private partnerships, how are they working, and why? And that we bring that together in a format to where we can start to talk about this centrally.
So Angie, you and I bear the scars of the BDAC discussion on state and local standards for broadband deployment. What's going on in Minnesota? Are you using a triple P type of system? I know you have everything up there, right?
Yeah, yes, we do. And I would say partnerships, public-private partnerships, are a cornerstone of Minnesota's broadband grant program. And with my time in Wisconsin before coming here, I could say the same thing about that state as well. It's and I think why it's so important, and what I've seen is when there's that public-private partnership on a project, everyone's more engaged. That's a community that's working together. That's a community that's involved. They have that relationship with their broadband provider. And that's where you're going to see adoption and success. That's where you're going to see, I always used to say, I don't just want to see infrastructure go in and not be used. I work in an economic development agency. Right. We want this infrastructure to be used for the vitality of these communities. And I think having those partnerships, and our program encourages it. And we have a competitive grant, so we score based on those partnerships. And to me, it's a key to a successful project.
And Rob, you're getting ready to launch a open access middle mile network. And have you seen public-private partnerships working at the last mile as well?
So our premier fund, the California Advanced Services Fund, which is a last mile funding primarily program, has been almost exclusively incumbent focused. And I think the promise of the PPPs is it allows us to explore other deployment models that we haven't really gone into a lot. There's some small examples in California, but we really want to try and pursue those more in working with the localities. And I think I mentioned earlier the caseworker approach, where we're, instead of waiting for providers to apply based on areas that are eligible, we're actually going to go out and work with localities to put together solutions with funding, using the various tools that we have now available. One of those being the loan loss reserve account, where we can provide seed funding to municipalities to float bonds to finance local municipal networks. Now, that could be operated by a nonprofit. It could be operated by a private company. Any of those options are on the table. And I think, what we realize now is this one-size-fits-all approach isn't working anymore. We've sort of run its course. So now we need to look at new solutions.
So you're actively encouraging new entrants, be they public or private, in the market?
Correct.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So
you're going to start and look probably more like Washington or Minnesota, where they have everything. So Brad, you have a requirement for nonprofit participants into your funds, has that really attracted community-based broadband deployment, or has it been primarily co-ops and member-owned organizations?
It's that's a great question. It's actually been a mixture of both. We've over the years done a number of projects with co-ops that are expanding into very rural, very mountainous, very challenging areas to deploy broadband. But I'd say we've seen a definite uptick in the last few years of these public-private partnerships where a municipality or a county or even a regional consortium of counties or economic development, a regional economic development agency, they apply for the funds, they deploy and own and maintain the infrastructure and do an open source or even issue an RFP to incumbent providers and select an incumbent provider and do it that way. But yeah, it's been a real challenge because we don't, it almost, so I guess to answer your question, yes, it does attract a lot of public-private partnerships, and it's because of the challenge of broadband being a private utility, not a public utility.
Okay. And does the ease of that vary by your states, I would think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Obviously, every state's different, and some states have stricter regulations than others. But I know off the top of my head, Pennsylvania and Virginia and North Carolina and Tennessee, those states have been very aggressive with the public-private partnerships. Kentucky and West Virginia each have their own kind of statewide broadband programs
Right.
that are being implemented. But yeah.
Well, I know that both West Virginia and Virginia passed very aggressive open access middle mile network. I'm sure Robert Zavale has looked into what they went into there, trying to get their IOUs to build middle mile on an open access model. Do we, Russ, have you seen an uptick since you went through your kerfuffle over the opening up of the PUDs to retail competition?
The underlying reason they did this is so that they can compete for RDOF money in the future. They wanted to have access to the federal money. It wasn't so much that they wanted to go and do retail authority, although now it's given them a hammer. It's given them a little leverage to say, hey, if you don't, we will. And I think that's certainly worth looking into. But most of our PUDs are doing the good work of building that open access network and allowing for retail providers to come in and compete. And then those hard to reach last miles are going to need some support, just like everybody else does. So it's been good in many of our areas.
So Angie, are you pretty evenly distributed in terms of community versus co-op versus incumbent provided networks in Minnesota?
I would say the majority of the networks in Minnesota are either in private or co-op networks. We do have a few municipal networks in our state. We do have communities in Minnesota can deploy their own broadband. There are a few caveats in statute here related to making sure that if the community does want to undertake providing their own broadband service and infrastructure, that service wouldn't compete with a private entity or with an entity that plans to offer service in the reasonable future. But what we tend to see for the most part is communities partnering with a provider to deploy service where the community may not be happy with their incumbent broadband provider. And I'd say for my part, whenever a community can find a provider to partner with, I'd say that's the probably the quickest and perhaps easiest path toward getting served. But I understand there are folks who have tried and can't get anyone to come to the table.
And Robert, do you have an absolute prohibition against community broadband, or just it hasn't happened?
No, there's no prohibition in statute.
So it's just people haven't felt the need to do it so far.
Yeah, it's been very incumbent focused until now. That said, I think, historically there was legislation preventing municipal networks, but I think that's now gone. So, there's no prohibition in place right now.
Okay. We have a little bit of time left. Do we have any more questions from the audience? So I have a final question, and this may spark some more discussion, which is, will this be the year that we finally have enough resources to get broadband to all the underserved communities in your state or region? I know Angie's talked about this, Robert's talked about it, Russ has talked about it, Brad's talked about it. Do you anticipate, if we get the infrastructure funding and we get a good disbursement of the American Rescue Plan money, that we will finally have enough funds to reach those unreachable areas? So who would like to go at that first? Russ?
Okay, sure. Absolutely.
And not through satellite.
No. And I think we will make a significant dent in the opportunity to deploy better infrastructure if the infrastructure money comes out as it's being stated in the $80 to $100 billion range. If that's the number they're talking about, I think we will have the opportunity to make a significant move in this country. And second, if those funds are given to selfish, I'm going to say bring them to the states. The states, you're hearing 4 states right here and with Brad, multiple states that obviously have focused on this effort at a level of detail that the federal government cannot. Allow the states to have some discretion in how those funds are distributed, because we are building the information that we need to make educated decisions to get that money out. So if that money's passed on into these state opportunities, allow us to do some of that, that's great. If not, and it's going to go to the traditional reverse auction funding stuff, I don't have a tremendous amount of confidence that we're going to solve the problem.
Angie?
Well, I will echo Russ there. I'm hopeful, but again, it really depends on how this funding is deployed and the parameters that are put around it. And just to reinforce what Russ said, we have state programs across the country that have been working successfully, and to the extent that we can be allowed to continue to do our work, or as Senator Klobuchar from the state of Minnesota has introduced a bill to allow state funding to pair better with federal funding, which I completely support. Just let us leverage our state funds with federal funds wherever we can, and leverage the collective knowledge of all of the folks in our states who have been working on these issues for so many years. I'm hopeful. I'm not ready to put a fine point on it, but I'd say this is our best chance at getting the work done with the amount of funding that's being discussed.
And Robert, will $7 billion be enough in California?
6. We were hoping for 7, but 6.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Will $6 billion be enough?
This is, I think, as Angie said, this is a once in a lifetime, funding opportunity that we have here. So we're working hard to put that to use. California is a big state. I expect this will take a big bite out of the unserved numbers. And then the underserved will get, a boost in service. So that will have an effect on affordability. I think to the extent that we can increase competition, that will always have a positive influence on making plans more affordable. And in a lot of cases, there is very little to no competition in broadband, as the president, indicated recently. And so it's something we're hopeful about, and we're definitely going to put all our effort into implementing.
And Brad, I know you serve a very distressed part of the country. Do you anticipate getting sufficient funding to get a lot of those people hooked up this year?
Yeah, a lot of the funding that's available, or will hopefully become available through the federal government, is specifically targeted for rural broadband. And obviously the ARC region is just that, it's a very rural area. So I think I'm going to agree with everyone else and say that, this is a tremendous opportunity to take a big bite out of the apple. I don't think it's going to solve it 100%. I think it's a bit of a well, part of it is it's kind of like a dog chasing the mailman, right? The standard for underserved over the past 10 years has gone up. The degree to which we use broadband has increased tremendously over the last several years. So I think, unfortunately, there's always going to be work to be done to bring high-speed broadband to rural communities.
So I do want to thank my panelists. I'm going to give them 8 minutes of their lives back. I think all 4 of them have been fabulously well prepared and answered many of our questions. And I just want to thank you again. And I want to tell you that the participant who has 9 million subs is not in any of your states. So unfortunately, won't help you here. But again, thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Craig for the wrap up.
Thank you so much, Heather. And what a great discussion. So many wonderful points brought out. I was really intrigued with across the board, the emphasis on the importance of appropriate and accurate data mapping. That's always been an issue. Also intrigued with the desire to find the right public-private partnerships and then share that knowledge. But I think that without question, Angie's remark of what an important golden opportunity we have, the once in a lifetime opportunity to take advantage of the tremendous amount of funding that's available today, but the importance though of getting it right through thoughtful planning. I think that really summed up so much of the importance of what was discussed here today. Another quick thanks to our presenting sponsors for the Zero Touch Learning series: Utopia Fiber, building a more connected nation; DXTEL, creators of the Harper Broadband Marketing Library; Calix, the cloud and software platforms to simplify businesses, excite subscribers, and grow value. A big thanks to ITK, In the Know Solutions Group, process first, technology second, and by your Zero Touch automation experts, ETI Software Solutions. Also, be sure to join the next edition of the Zero Touch Learning Series, August 3rd. Heather, you've got a great one on tap for that. Get Lost, a broadband mapping tool that really works. That sort of is a follow-up to today's discussion. I can't thank everyone enough for participating today. Heather, phenomenal job. Our panelists, thank you so much. On behalf of everyone, we'll see you next time right here on the Zero Touch Learning Series. Good afternoon.
Thank you, guys.